Alright, I know I kind of petered out a little bit in the end of my previous video, and that's honestly mostly because I was getting to a point where I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. Uh, Apologies if that ran a little long. I'm planning on putting some sort of note in there to suggest that, in the description, to suggest that most of that video can be ignored. I am going to include it in this playlist though, for the sake of completeness. Okay, so last time I ended it with, interestingly enough, one final cell to finish off the sort of possibilities that we had been marking. So let's just finish that one off, just so that we have it done. And again, this is going to be Chris's possible birth months. So this is going to be, can't be 1, could be 2, but not 3, not 4, could be 5. Can't be 7 because of the 6-7 pair that we have between Wanda and Amy's birth months. It can't be 8. Can be 9. Let me put that in. But it can't be 10. Looks like it can be either 11 or 12. Yeah, okay, so we'll put those in as well. Okay, that's a little bit inconvenient to have this different sized height of this particular row. We will get rid of that fairly shortly. Okay, so what is the next step that we need to take? Our next step is going to be to recognize that the month that Melody's scene was set in other words, January, which we figured out in our last video, is the same as Violet's birth month, because Melody in her scene is invited to Violet's birthday. So that means that this set month is going to be the same as Violet's. In other words, Violet's birth month is also January. That's going to be useful because it's going to eliminate the possibility that she sits in seat number 1. And now that we know that she sits in seat number 3, not only can we eliminate the possibility that David sits in seat number 3, but we can also figure out where both David, Jim, and Melody sit. If Violet sits in seat number 3, there's David and Jim in between her and Melody. So that's going to take up seats 5 and 7, which means that Melody is going to be in seat number 9. Okay. We also need to figure out what seats Jimmy has available, and let's look through those. 1's not available. Remember that Jimmy's seat was odd. 1 isn't available, 3 isn't available, 5 is, 7 isn't, 9 isn't, and 11 isn't, which means that Jimmy's in seat 5 and that David is in seat 7. Once we know this, we can eliminate 5 from the possibilities for Jimmy's grade and for his height. We can also eliminate the 7s from David's height as a possibility, and we can eliminate it here as well. And we know that David was not in the 7th grade during that particular scene. Okay, now that we know that, how do we progress from here? Well, I think the most there is one point that I want to make before we continue, and that is going to be that Melody mentions in her scene that the anniversary of Project Archangel is coming up next month. She's in January at the time, the Project Archangel announcement happens basically a year prior to Melody's scene. But since the year anniversary is coming up, that tells us that the Project Archangel announcement was actually in February, since this scene was set in January. Okay, so that tells us when Violet's scene was set. We can also, while we're at it, eliminate a couple of other 2s. So in other words, Violet isn't 4'2", and more usefully, Amy's scene is not set in February, and Tim's scene is not set in February. And we know now that it's set instead in June, and we can back sort of what's the term? Backfill or reverse, I guess, and eliminate the 6 from Amy's possible set month. So now we know that she was the 12th month. In other words, Amy's scene is set in December. And we now have our set months for each of our scenes. Okay. We don't have any other 12s in here we can eliminate, but this 6 is a little bit useful because we can eliminate a 6 here. Okay, now that we've gotten this far, the next thing that we want to do doesn't really have to do with Sudoku at all. We're going to face a challenge just because we have 2 different completely empty rows down here at the bottom. And we needed a few bits of information here, particularly these facts that Violet's scene is in February, and that her birth month is in January, to settle some of these ages. What do we know about the ages of some of these people? We know that Jimmy is Alistair's brother. Again, I'm going to refer you to our family tree here. We know that Jim is Alistair's brother. We know that Roger and Violet are Alistair's kids, that Bridget is married to Roger and that Melody is married to Violet, that Greg is Jim's child. We also know that Wanda and Chris are children of Greg, that Amy is a child of Violet and Melody, and that Jane is a child of Roger and Bridget, and that her kids, Jane's kids, are David and Tim. With this information, can we determine some of the ages? Well, we can certainly say that no child is going to be older than their parent. We don't necessarily know that someone at a higher generation is going to be older than someone in a lower generation, but we can figure out some of these relative placements fairly easily. We have basically 4 generations we need to look at. We have this generation, which is going to contain 5 different people: Greg, Bridget, Roger, Melody, and Violet. We have Jim in the generation above that. We have Jane in the generation below those 5. And then below Jane, or possibly with Jane, we're going to have David, Tim, Amy, Wanda, and Chris. But these 5 here, Greg, Bridget, Roger, Melody, and Violet, are the ones that we're going to look at and try to figure out how they are related to each other. And how their ages compare to each other. So what do we know? We know that Roger in his scene is in the 8th grade. And at that point, since he mentions that Greg is 2 years younger than him, we already know that Greg is younger and he's in the 6th grade. We know that when he was in the 1st grade, Roger still would have been older, but Greg was also in the same class as Bridget. So Greg and Bridget are going to have similar ages. They're both going to be younger than Roger. How does Greg's age compare to, say, Violet's? Greg's going to be older than Violet because it's mentioned in, again, scene number 7, that Violet, reminiscing on that particular photograph that was taken in that scene, mentions that she was in the 4th grade. Since Roger was in the 8th grade, Greg was in the 6th, Violet was in the 4th, we have no reason to believe anybody was held back or anything. Any of those characters, at least. So we know that Violet is going to be younger than Greg, and for that matter, Bridget as well, because in the first grade, Greg and Bridget are similar ages. So right now we have a sort of tier list where Roger's at the top of the age pyramid. Then we have Greg and Bridget, and then under those two we have Violet. Okay, well, how about Melody? How does her age compare to these guys? Well, Melody, we know her set month, we know her birth month. Now, when Violet is narrating her scene, she's in the 10th grade, and she's about she has just had her birthday at this point in the 10th grade. A year later, Melody has her scene, and at that point, she's in the 12th grade. What does that tell us? That tells us that Melody is older than Violet. Okay? Because, again, in this scene, Violet is in the 10th grade. Less than a year later, 11 months later to be exact, Melody is in the 12th grade. So Melody's older than Violet. How does Melody's age compare to Greg and Bridget's ages? Well, we've already established that chronologically, Melody is 6th, and Melody's scene is 6th, and Bridget's scene comes before that as the 5th. And Bridget mentions in her scene that she is about to turn 18, and Melody is not 18 yet, even though her scene comes afterward. And a matter of fact, her birthday is a couple months out from when her scene is set. What that means is that Bridget, at least, is older than Melody, if not Greg as well. Although I should mention that even during Bridget's scene, it's mentioned the name of the person who sent Bridget her text in her scene isn't explicit, but the takeaway is meant to be that is Greg. He's going off to college, which would suggest that Greg is also older than Melody by the time her scene rolls around in January, which would be about 5 months or so after Bridget's scene, which was set in July. Okay, so we have some sets here. So the oldest of that group I just mentioned, is definitively Roger. The oldest of the group of Roger, Melody, Greg, Violet, and Bridget. So, knowing this, is there any way we can compare Roger and Jimmy's ages? And the answer is yes, because in his scene, Jimmy's actually turning 40. In scene 7, Jimmy is turning 40. Well, Roger's still in the 8th grade, so Jimmy is quite a bit older than Roger. So Jimmy is going to be, since everybody else in this scene is a descendant of one of those 5, that tells us immediately that Jimmy is definitely going to be our oldest. So we'll put 12 down for him. We'll eliminate the 12 here as a possibility for his height. We now know that he is not 4'12" or 5 feet. The next oldest is definitely going to be Roger. As we've mentioned, he is definitely the oldest. We don't necessarily know who's older between Greg and Bridget. We only know that Melody is older than Violet, and that Violet, we only know that Melody is older than Violet, and we know that Bridget is older than Melody. Can we conclusively show that Greg is also older than Melody? As I've said, we had that section about where it's mentioned that Greg was going to college through a text. That isn't deductive, though. That's an abductive conclusion. And let's see if there's anything that we could say that would concretely show that Greg is older. Well, there is this. There is this. And this honestly should have been the first thing I thought about. Originally, Greg and Bridget were in the same grade, right? Bridget was held back, had to repeat the 11th grade. And she ended up also needing to complete high school around the same time Melody did. What does that tell us? That tells us that Greg is definitely older than Melody because neither of them was held back, and Greg is a grade older. Okay. So that shows us that Greg is older. So that tells us that we have Roger in the 11th spot. Greg and Bridget, we don't have a definitive way to compare their ages. But we do know that they take up spots 9 and 10. Since Melody is the next oldest, she's going to be in the 8th slot. She's going to be, she's going to take up slot 8, and Violet, who is younger than her, is going to take up slot 7. And since she takes up slot 7, we can eliminate the 7 from the possibility for her height. Okay, now there is something that we can, an important step forward at this point that we can make, and that is the fact that we have 11 different numbers in Melody's column. We only need one more. What's the number that's missing? It's a 7. We now know that Melody is 7th in line to the helm. Okay. Another point I should point out is that we can put the possibility of 9 and 10 in for both Greg and for Bridget, and if you'll notice, it's impossible for Bridget to be the 10th youngest, I guess you could say, or the 3rd oldest, and that's because she already has a height of 4'10", which means we can delete that, and we can say that Greg is actually going to be the 3rd oldest, and Bridget is going to be our 4th oldest. Now, this has a couple of Sudoku conclusions or ramifications on the Sudoku grid, but before we get to those, I just want to quickly state that you can actually tell that Bridget is younger otherwise, but it's requires some kind of obscure knowledge about the American education system. In most states, there's a cutoff that happens around September, sometimes October, that once you are where you have to be a certain age. Basically, the way I hear it, or the way I've heard of it, is you have to be 5 years old by September 1st in order to start kindergarten. So September 1st is basically the break that happens. And we know that since that occurs in that, September is the break that separates people of different grades. So how do we compare people of different grades? Well, Greg was born in either November or December, and Bridget was born in August, which means that Bridget is going to be one of the youngest people in her class. Greg is going to be one of the oldest. But that relies on some outside information that I don't expect people to be aware of. Okay, so now that we have, we've definitively shown that Greg is the 3rd oldest, We have here that he's the 10th youngest, which means that we can eliminate 10 from his possible seats. This 12, we know that he's in seat 12, which means that Bridget definitely isn't. And we also know that since he's in seat 12, he can't have 12 as a birth month. He was born in November. Is there any other 11s we can eliminate? Yes, there is, right here with Roger, which means that Roger was either born in May or December. And let's see, there was another one that we figured out that allowed us, right, Bridget's age allowed us to eliminate 9 o'clock from her potential times and 9 from her potential seats. The fact that we now know that she sits, or she is in 4 o'clock, her scene is set in 4 o'clock, tells us that she's not in seat 4, she is in seat 1. And let's see, since she's also in 4 o'clock, that also tells us that Roger isn't, which means that Roger's scene takes place at 5 o'clock, which is consistent with what Uncle Billy was saying about the sunlight during that scene. This 5 here means we can eliminate these 5s. Amy's scene did not take place at 5 o'clock. Neither did Violet's. We can also eliminate this 5, which means that we can say that Roger was definitely born in December. Why is that something that we might want to take note of? If you'll remember, Sagittarius has the center of the galaxy within itself. That was something that was mentioned in scene number 8 when Greg is talking about Sagittarius. And the silhouette of the loser of the duel was in his own birth sign. The 2 people in that duel were Roger and Greg. Greg's birth sign is Scorpio. His actual, that's where the sun was when he was born, in that constellation. And Roger's was in Sagittarius. Roger was the loser of that duel. Let me quickly eliminate the 12 from the possibility of Chris's birth month then. And let's come back up here. To this 5, is there anything else that we could have concluded from that? We determined something for Amy and for Bridget, if I'm not mistaken. Or possibly Violet. Yes. Violet at least. We can eliminate this 8 here. That was the time, right? We eliminated a time for Violet. Who was the other person we eliminated the possible time for? Bridget we already knew. It might have just been Amy. And if that's the case, there's no additional information we can tell from this row. Although we can say, okay, that must have been it, because we can eliminate this 10 from the possibility of Jane's time. Okay, well, this tells us, first of all, we now know the times that each scene was set in. That's going to be this row here. So Jane's scene was set at 9 o'clock. And that means we can eliminate the 9 from the possibility of her grade. Oh, All right, just really quickly, I just want to make sure I'm not forgetting anything here. I think that's just about most of the stuff that we can actually eliminate for the moment. To continue, though, we do have now a couple of different columns that have completely filled out sections here, or nearly complete. They have 11 values in their column, which means there's only one missing. For Roger, that's going to be the 4. Roger is actually not first in line, he is fourth in line. Greg is going to end up being, I believe he's 9th in line. And Bridget is 12th in line. We're going to find out that the fact that Jane was born from Bridget instead of Roger effectively disinherited Bridget. And I'm going to explain how the line is set up once we actually have the Sudoku completely filled out, the succession line. Okay, so from here, what can we do? Well, we can say that Violet has a 5 and a 12 in this particular cell, which means that she has a 5 and a 12 in this particular cell, but we know that it isn't a 12. So that means Violet is 5th in line, making sense. She would be after Roger, who is 4th. And we can eliminate the 5 from her cell here for her height. And that tells us that Violet is 4'12". In other words, she's the tallest during her scene, because she's actually 5 feet tall. Okay. Where else can we look? There are no other full columns. That's going to mean that we're going to have to try to figure out some more ages, some more relative ages. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 left. So we're going to plug in those possible values, and we're going to eliminate the ones that are already in the column. So Wanda is going to be either the 4th or the 5th youngest. Tim is going to be first, second, third, or 4th. Amy is either going to be the 2nd or the 5th. I should say, well, I should say that we know, I suppose I should put 6 in here as well, just to be conclusive. This is not accurate in the sense that it doesn't actually represent what they have, but I'm going to explain later why we know it can't be the 6th. None of these people can be the 6th youngest. And mostly the reason is I forgot about Jane. Let's see here. David can be first, third, or 5th, or to be complete, 6th. Jane could be 2nd, third, or 6th. And Chris can be second or 5th. Okay. All right, now that we have this possibility in place, how are we going to figure out which is which? Well, we know this much. We know that Tim was the youngest in his room. The only other person, because the two people who were absent from that room were Greg and were Chris. Chris can't be younger than Tim because Chris has a possibility of 2 but doesn't have a possibility of 1. Someone has to be the youngest person overall. And Tim is the only person who can fit that bill. So we're going to eliminate all of these possibilities and conclude that Tim is the youngest person. And that means we can eliminate 1 from David's possibilities. All right then. Now the question I want to ask is, among these people who could potentially be in this 6th position, the 6th oldest, or the 6th youngest, I should say, the oldest of these people, who could that be? Well, it's not going to be Amy, because Amy is in some school grade during her scene. And at that point, Jane already has her kids, David and Tim. It also tells us, by the way, that since David is the child of Jane, that he definitely is not older than her. So we can eliminate 6th from that possibility. And Amy as well, because she's the one who's speaking during that scene. We also know that Amy and Wanda are basically in the same grade, so we can eliminate 6 from that possibility as well. Which leaves us with only one person who could potentially be the oldest of this group, and that would be Jane. Okay, now that we've settled the fact that Jane is definitely number 6 in terms of age, we can figure out some other things. Amy is either 2 or 5. Chris is either 2 or 5. That tells us that 2 and 5 are locked down in these 2 positions. And that tells us that we can eliminate 5 from David's possibility. In other words, David is the 3rd youngest. We can also eliminate 5 from this possibility here. Eliminating, really quickly, eliminating 3 from David's possibility here, just to be thorough, we're going to have to eliminate the 3 from this point in the grid. And since we've established that Wanda is the 4th youngest, we have to eliminate the 4 from this possibility here. Okay. So that leaves us with Amy and Chris. Which of the 2 is going to end up being older? It's a good question, and it's not immediately clear that there is a way to resolve that difference. So I think we're going to leave it alone for now and just continue with what we have learned. And let's see if we can ask ourselves if there are any new positions or full full columns that we can fill in. So we're getting pretty close, but we aren't quite there yet. We never did end up filling in Jane, Amy, and Tim's potential seat numbers. Let's go ahead and do that now. I'm fairly confident that this is going to give us some sort of answer here, or resolve things a little bit further. So 1's taken, 2 is taken, 3 is taken, 4 isn't. 5 is taken, 6 is taken, 7 is taken, 8 is taken, 9 is taken. We're looking at 10 and 11 for the possibilities. Both of them are in his column. In other words, Tim can only have seat 4. Okay, well that was immediately useful. Let's see if we can eliminate anything, and we can. Moving on to Amy's seat. Again, we have 10 and 11 as possibilities. 10, Amy's scene is set at 10 o'clock, which means her seat has to be seat 11, leaving the only seat left, seat 10, in which Jane sits. We're getting closer to finishing at some of these columns, but we don't have anything that's entirely ready. We can say about Jimmy's line of succession, it's either going to be 2, 4, or 8. And since 4 is already taken, it's also going to be 2 or 8. And now that's going to give us something. This 2-8 pair here is going to tell us that Jimmy's in the 4th grade. There are no 4s to eliminate from that row, however. Okay. I guess I haven't been completely thorough here because there's a 6 that is eliminated because we've established that Jane is the 6th youngest, which leaves her at in either the 2nd or the 3rd grade, and also tells us that down here she must be either 2nd or 3rd in line. Okay, here's something. Where does the 3 go in the grade row? Well, that's not something, because it can go in a couple of different places. Let's see what the possibilities are. Excuse me for a second, I'm just trying to figure out where to go from here. I feel like this might be a good place to stop the video until I figure out my next steps.